Mr. Samaria.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. We're here to talk about fiscal year 2010 budget balancing, and we've had a lot of press and discussion about 2011, but we really still have a balancing issue in this current year, and so we want to just to kind of talk more about it and give you some updated information and how we believe we can sort of address this year's remaining shortfall that we reported to you and end the year hopefully without having to use any reserves. So just for the benefit of the public, just some background. In June 2009, we adopted the current year budget, the fiscal year 2010 budget, and you may recall that it included about $10.8 million in what we call budget cuts or adjustments. They were mostly expenditure reductions, but there were some revenue enhancements in there. But 2 weeks before we actually came to council to adopt that budget in June, we had received data from the State Board of Equalization and our data for sales tax that indicated that we were already kind of behind the curve even before we got to July 1. And since that time through about October, the news got even worse. We got more bed tax information. We got more sales tax information that came in September. And so we came to council in November to recommend reducing our revenue estimates by about $2.9 million, but also along with some recommended adjustments to balance the budget. So we effectively balanced the budget this year in November, but most of the stuff that we used were one-time measures like keeping positions vacant and the like. But we felt we were in pretty good shape. Since November, the revenues declined even more, and when we came to you in February, we reported to you that we had an additional shortfall this year. We were projecting of about $3.7 million, and we did present to the City Council some recommended measures to partially offset those shortfalls. We were short about $1 million, and so we're here to talk about sort of where we're at now. So today's purpose of today's report is to follow up on two key items that were contained in the list of measures we presented to you in February. And we want to present to you newly identified measures and other options to further close the current year projected budget shortfall. And then when we get to council today, we'd like to have them approve certain budget actions to affect some of the recommended measures. So I'm not going to go through this in much detail other than just to remind you, we showed this to you in February. Again, this was the impacts between November and roughly February, January, additional revenue declines. In total, about $2.3 million. The big hits were in our sales tax. We got December data that was bad. Bed tax just continuing to slide and so forth. So again, our revenue shortfalls just from November through the current date were projected at $2.3 million. But we also talked about in February that we had budgeted this year, as we had been for the last several years, a budgeted year-end variance, and that represented just the expenditure side of things. Typically, we would budget a variance for both revenue surpluses and expenditure shortfalls, and because the revenues were declining so much, we said, let's just lower that to an amount that reflected just what we expect to see in savings on the expenditure side. However, because the measures we implemented in November were really keeping vacant positions unfunded and vacant, we've essentially already capitalized all those savings, so we really don't expect to generate all of this year-end savings. We've already again captured that or capitalized that back in November. So really, our shortfall is more on the order of $3.7 million. On February 25th, these are the measures we presented to you. It included holding additional positions vacant since November. So for example, Miss Joan Kent, who retired in December. Those savings we had not capitalized on in November, so those are the additional savings. And we have other positions that had become vacant since November that we believe could generate about $600,000 in savings by June or through June. We also talked about the additional salary savings in the police department. You might recall that we had already banked on about $500,000 in savings from July 1 through December. And then the expectation was we would send as many as we could in January to the academy, and of course we wouldn't see the savings in the second half of the year. And as it turns out that we weren't able to send as many as we would have liked, so we still have about 7 positions that are vacant. And this then assumes that we are not going to send anybody to the academy for the rest of the year, and we would generate $435,000 in savings as a result through June. We talked about the overtime in the fire department. That meant basically eliminating overtime up to 3 positions. and that would involve, it could potentially impact stations that are open. We would expect that we would have probably one station, being closed as a result of this, but it would have saved us $489,000 if implemented on March 1. Now, since then, we have, and as we'll see, we have identified other measures, again, that we think we can close the gap even without this item. So we're going to be proposing to eliminate this from the discussion for the current year. It'll still be something that the fire department will be considering and having as an option for next year to address the bigger problem. But for this year, we think it's not necessary to implement this particular measure. We also had indicated that we would be reducing Parks and Recreation capital projects. They already were funded this year. They aren't going to need all the dollars, and we can reduce those costs, and that would save us about $269,000. And then there was additional rebates, and we've been doing this for the last couple of years. As you know, our workers' compensation program and liability programs, for that matter, they've been generating some surplus for us. We established the budget and the funding for those programs based on an actuary study. It was done back in 2008, and they established what we should be collecting from the various funding departments over the next 2 years. The good news is that our results have been much more favorable than what the actuaries would have expected or had expected, so we've been generating surpluses. And this $600,000 is the portion that is attributable to the general fund through June 30, 2009, so at the end of last year. It doesn't reflect anything that would have happened or will happen this year. That's just through June 30. We've used a fair amount of that already, the general fund's portion. And there is about $600,000 remaining, and we have recommended to use that. And then one item, this wasn't actually separately called out in February. It was part of just one number that was miscellaneous departmental cuts. But one of the items is using the RDA to fund relocation costs associated with the renovation of the fire station annex on Chapala Street. As you may know, staff, administrative staff, is currently residing in a building we're renting or leasing on De La Vina Street, and we're incurring costs for that. And this general fund has, and the fire department budgeted for those costs this year, and we're anticipating to spend them next year. But as it turns out, the RDA felt that really could be a cost associated with the project. It's typical that we would pay for relocation costs out of the RDA. And so in doing so, we could save this year $171,000 by saying RDA will include that as part of the project costs. We won't spend it out of the fire department's budget. And so again, this year we'd save $171,000. Next year, because they were planning on, of course, having that in the budget, we're going to save about $240,000. In total, it's about $480,000 that we'd be paying in relocation costs and lease costs that would be paid for by the RDA. And then, again, about $195,000 of other non-labor cuts spread out among all the departments. So in total, we had measures we identified of almost $2.8 million. Now, we back out the overtime and fire, we're down to about $2.3 million in the revised measures. So we had originally projected, as you saw earlier, a $3.7 million problem. Our revised measures reduced that by $2.3 million. And then just wanted to point out that every month we're looking at our revenue estimates. We get new data particularly for our bed tax, but utility users tax and other things as well. And we believe that because of some better than expected results, particularly in bed tax, we could raise our estimates back up by about $300,000. It's a negative number because it reduces the scope of the problem, but it's an increase to revenue projections of about $300,000 that lowers our outstanding shortfall to about $1.1 million. And just want to point out, here are the revenues that we are projecting we're not proposing to make any adjustments to the budget, but these are the revenues we're expecting to see some increase or decrease on a net basis, adding about $300,000. Again, I mentioned bed tax. We're assuming that we're going to generate an additional $260,000 beyond what we projected back in January and brought to you in February. It was utility users tax, same thing, just again, based on more data that seems more favorable than we had thought. We are seeing actually a downward trend in our business license tax, so we're assuming we're going to lower that by $100,000 or at least get $105,000 less by the end of the year. But in total, an additional amount of $311,000, which I'm just rounding because they're just estimates for now, to about $300,000. So new items that we're proposing to address the outstanding $1.1 million. One is additional use of self-insurance reserves. As I mentioned, the $600,000 that we've already used as part of the revised measure, that was the amount of surpluses we had accumulated through June 30 of 2009. This 480 reflects what we expect to see by the end of this year. And we expect that we're going to generate surpluses in that fund of about, in total, almost $800,000, closer to $750,000. Of that portion, the general funds portion is for about $480,000. So we believe we can use those monies, essentially transfer them over to the general fund and to help our problem. And again, these are just, again, premiums that they charge all the funds that are in excess in a sense of what's really needed in the end based on what claims we've incurred, what insurances we paid out. And primarily it was driven by the fact that the actuary established these rates 2 years ago. And, you know, in hindsight, they would probably say you don't need as much. But because of that, we were just generating these surpluses. So again, this is a portion that we can transfer to the general fund. And then next is pretty amazing that we would have discovered this. We have solid waste franchise fees that are being collected and accounted for in our solid waste fund. Franchise fees in general are designed to essentially compensate the local government for the use of right-of-ways. For example, trucks, you know, using our streets and the like. And we have franchise agreements and franchise being paid by a lot of our major utilities, SoCal Edison and gas company and the like. And we had been, again, accounted for those in the solid waste fund, but there's no restriction on those. Those typically are a general fund revenue. And for whatever reason, when we created this new fund, this solid waste fund about 10 years ago, we just started accounting for these revenues in that fund. And we're proposing that we start, first we move it this year back to the general fund, and then in the future, on an ongoing basis, retain it as a general fund revenue. It is going to have an impact on the solid waste fund. It's a lot of money to take away. But as it turns out, we actually have accumulated reserves in our solid waste fund beyond what we really think is appropriate or necessary. We have about $1.8 million there. Part of that will pay for the gas extraction system we're building at Elings Park. But we believe over the next couple of years, we could use those reserves to sort of offset this loss of revenues and then actually bring those reserves down to probably a more appropriate level. In addition, by then, we expect that our recycling revenues, which have really tanked, starting next year, 2 years ago, we would have been collecting $800,000, or a year ago. Next year, we're going to pay $37,000 because of the rapid decline in the commodity values. But in a couple of years, we expect those revenues to climb back up to probably offset this loss of franchise fee revenue. So we think in the end, we're going to be pretty well balanced, in the next couple of years, bringing down reserves and then seeing those revenues go back up from recyclables. So really, our standing shortfall, if you implement these measures, which we're recommending, is basically down to $211,000, and we think that this may be closed by just we're dealing with estimates here, so it's possible that we can close the year without using any of this because we see more favorable results in our revenues or more favorable results in our expenditures. It's a small enough number now that we think that we're basically there, we're balanced. If in the end we use $100,000 in reserves, maybe not the worst thing in light of what the problem we had beginning in November. So that's kind of where we're at. Now, we do have a couple of other potential measures that we're not necessarily recommending, but we just thought we'd bring to your attention. One is the use of redevelopment agency funds for the downtown parking capital program. And I have to explain this one because you're kind of wondering, how does that help the general fund? This year, we've implemented a strategy whereby the contract for the maintenance of our State Street sidewalks would be split between the general fund and the downtown parking fund. It used to be all paid for out of the Parks and Recreation Department general fund, totaling about $625,000. So we split that up. So downtown parking is now paying for half of that. If we were to say to the downtown parking, we're going to cover your capital program this year, we're going to pay for whatever capital programs you incurred in cost this year, you could use those monies then to pay for the remaining portion of that contract for the maintenance of the State Street sidewalks. So, for example, if RDA were to contribute $312,000 to the downtown parking fund, then that money could be used to pay for the additional $312,000 for the contract to maintain State Street sidewalk, saving them the general fund money for not having to do that. So we're shifting the full cost of the contract to downtown parking, but they would generate the savings by having the RDA pay for their capital program this year. And in the report, you'll see there are a couple of projects in there. The big one is it's called The revenue control equipment, that project actually is a much bigger than what's this year, but this year they will have incurred about $271,000 for that project. So the RDA would pay for that along with other equipment costs. Again, that would allow then the downtown parking fund to pay for their other half of the State Street maintenance contract, freeing up the money in the general fund. I know that's kind of convoluted, but hopefully that makes sense. Or any questions on that one? Okay.
Sure. Well, before we take questions, is there anybody here for public comment on this item? No. Okay. Mr. Francisco.
Mr. Samario, what's the RDA justification for this?
It relates to the downtown parking structures. It's actually the RDA owns those parking structures. They're not owned by the downtown parking fund.
Okay.
When the RDA ceases to exist, they will actually be then reverted over to the downtown parking. But really, they're owned by the RDA, and they have historically been paying for those major equipment costs or renovation costs or improvements.
Okay, thank you.
Please continue. Please. Well, do you have a question about that?
Yes,
Councilmember Sell.
thank you. What new revenues were created in November? You were in the first slide, I believe it said that there were new revenues created in November.
Yes, committee member Self. I don't remember specifically. I know, for example, police department, they were able to generate, they established a new fee for a towing fee, I believe. A vehicle release fee is what it was. I don't have a lot of the details of what there were a number of little things that we did, but in the magnitude, they weren't a lot. But there were some things the department did, either raising revenues or adding new revenues. In the finance department, for example, we established a late fee for utility bills. It's going to generate $175,000 for us. That was a new revenue this year. So things of that nature. I just can't recall a lot of the details, though.
Okay.
Yeah, those were part of the adopted budget that was effective July 1.
Okay, and my other question is, and one of the items saving was non-labor department cuts. Could you describe
Sure.
that?
Again,
Thank you.
It's $195,000 spread over about 9 general fund departments, and it's in kind of things like training, supplies and services, not replacing certain pieces of equipment, but individually very small items, but in the aggregate, a fair amount of money, $195,000.
Thank you.
So the next item is as at least another potential measure is the use of utility users tax revenues from the streets fund. As you know, half of our utility users taxes go to our streets fund. There is a portion of that that is unrestricted. The portion related to telecom under Measure G, when we implemented that, effectively it freed up the restriction of certain portions of our utility users tax. So theoretically, if we wanted to, if that was council's direction, we could take any portions that were available, and that's the key word, that are available in there, and bring them back to the general fund. As it turns out, our streets program, which relies on not only utility users tax revenues, but also Measure A revenues or transportation sales taxes, gas tax revenues, and the like, those revenues are have also been impacted, just like the general fund revenues. Those have also been impacted. So they are right now dealing with about $1.8 million in total, $1.8 million revenue shortfall that they're going to have to contend with. Now, they've been able to identify operating cost savings to offset part of that, but they're still going to be left with about $1 million that they're going to have to find through capital projects that they're not going to be able to do, deferring, not doing, etc. So they have about $1 million hole still to fill. In order for us to generate any additional revenues, they're going to have to find other projects that they could free up beyond the $1 million in order to say, well, we might be able to bring back some of the money for the general fund. We don't think it's going to be a lot of money. If we're just kind of, for now, based on the real quick analysis, we think it's about 150, but it may not even be that much. There's not a lot of money there. We won't know for sure until we complete that analysis. So that's why we're not recommending it. We just wanted to identify that, particularly because we were asked to sort of look at that by council back in February. So the additional measures are about $463,000. So what we're recommending, at least for council, is that they approve the $480,000 transfer of the revenues from the self-insurance fund to the general fund, that they approve the $440,000 transfer of solid waste franchise fees to the general fund, and then the agency board allocate the $480,000 in total needed for the relocation costs, lease costs, from the RDA's contingency account to this project. And so they would be funding the project, and that would free up the savings, or at least create savings in the general fund this year and next year. And with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Are there any other questions from the committee members?
Yes, indeed.
Mr. Francisco.
Thank you. Mr. Samario, on the solid waste franchise fees, how much is that annually?
Committee Member Francisco, it's about $440,000 annually. It's a pretty stable number.
And so how long has that fee been going into the solid waste fund instead of the general fund?
From its inception, which I think was probably about 10, 12 years ago.
So how much of the 1.8 million in reserves would you say has come from that source?
Committee Member Francisco, I have no idea. It's hard to trace a dollar bill into what generates the revenues, but it's all part of the overall sort of revenues over costs that have generated those reserves.
Right. But my question, I guess, fundamentally, I think you hear where I'm going here. I don't understand why that, if it was general fund money, it was going in to somewhere other than the general fund in the first place. But if it's been doing that for 10 or 12 years, we're talking about, $4 or $5 million, and you've got a 1.8 million reserve right now.
Right.
So presumably a substantial chunk of that is actually attributable to general fund money over the years.
I'm not sure that's correct, because it could be just recycling revenues that as well. We've had some years where, like this past year, we're going to generate $800,000 in revenues from that. In order to stay balanced, we only needed about $450,000. So those monies for sure fell into the reserves. So it's just I think it's a mix of revenues that that exceeded overall costs. I'm not sure how you can attribute any portion of that 1.8 to any one single source.
And I want to clarify a little, because we actually set up that solid waste fund, I think, about 5 years ago. It's not 10. I think it's when we extended the contract with Marlboro, but I know it was on my watch because I was pushing to do it. And originally we were using the excess money in there for recycling activities, and then we eventually enacted a program fee to pay for most of that. But clearly, a significant amount of that could be attributed to the franchise fee.
Yeah.
And we weren't that. I mean, we knew the money was building up, but at the time we were very concerned about the Elines Park city, the former city landfill there, and the cost to clean that up. And we actually thought at one time that the cost was going to be well over $1 million. And so we were saying that's our bank account to pay for those cleanup costs, and attributing it back to the solid waste fund was appropriate. So that was kind of as we looked at those monies in there, we said, good, we feel pretty good that we'll be able to cover those cleanup costs.
Mm-hmm. But so it sounds like the cleanup costs, we have a different estimate of those.
It's about $800,000, I think $785. In fact, it's in the capital budget that we'll be recommending to spend next year.
So potentially there's more than 440 available if we want to transfer it to the general fund.
Yes.
Okay.
You were thinking exactly what I was thinking, but so I guess it's just my question would be, so basically that's it's more limited by the solid waste fund's ability than it is by our legal ability, because we could make a case that it's been $440,000 for 5 years or so, which is $2.5 million, but you would not recommend that simply because of the solid waste inability to adapt to that at this juncture.
I guess that's a good way to say that. We can obviously raise fees next year to completely offset that if we're going to pull all the remaining reserves out of there after we pay for the gas extraction system. We're just suggesting that we could adapt to that over time before we have to raise fees. But certainly, if we want to raise fees next year equal to $440,000, we would sort of maintain a balance.
Well, I could see asking staff to recommend for us a yearly payback number, what they feel is sustainable or not sustainable. If you looked at that number over the next 5 years and just said, well, yeah, maybe we could afford to pay back to the general fund $100,000 a year or something like that. But I guess what I would ask is for staff to look at that and to recommend to us a number to do a solid waste payback, if that's something that you'd be interested in, Mr. Francis.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if an earlier city council, obviously this happened before I was on board, made a conscious decision about this. And it seems to me that if we've had $440,000 a year for 5 or 6 years of general fund money going into this fund, that has to be addressed one way or the other. Either we as a council decide that's fine, that money needs to go there, or we decide no, we need that in the general fund.
Then let's be sure to put staff direction on that in the motion. Does the committee have any feelings about the other two? Can we put that slide up? The previous slide. Those two. Does the committee have any feelings about this? Because my feeling is that we do not want to plan to have, with how difficult things have been, we don't want to plan to have a less than balanced budget. I would be much happier going forward with at least one of these two, so that we would be essentially making the mid-year adjustments to have a balanced budget, and that I would first of all recommend the RDA, the swap for downtown parking funds, because it is something that would not hurt the downtown parking, because we can make available the RDA funds. It's an RDA facility, so I think it's very easy to make that connection. And in addition, my general sense is, in looking at downtown parking, we're also improving in a number of we just had a great report on how much money we were saving downtown parking with all the lighting fixtures and so forth. So I do think that there's the ability to adjust to this, and it would save this general fund an awful lot of money. And we could also do it next year, which would already get us ahead of the game for next year.
A question about that.
Mr. Francisco.
Mr. Samario, that first option, has that been discussed with the downtown parking committee?
Actually, I'm not sure. No, that has not been.
Okay.
Apparently. And I will add that the availability of this option for next year, we're not sure, because there would have to be sufficient projects, because it can't be for maintenance. There have to be projects sufficient to this amount. And my understanding is there may not be able to arrive at the same number. It may be a much smaller number for next year.
I mean, it seems like a reasonable idea to me, but I'd like to get their input as well.
I guess the other thing is, to do this, how quickly would we have to act on this particular item?
We have until June 30 to make a decision.
So meaning the
Sure.
money wouldn't be
Yeah,
spent.
time is not necessarily by June 30.
Let's, and I'll just tell you, in absence of actually talking to the downtown parking about why it's important, they're going to hate the idea. I mean, I can just tell you that in advance. But I think we need to talk to them about how difficult things are in the city as a whole, and maybe especially after there has been across the board concessions and so forth, that this would be something that they would be willing to do as part of helping the general fund. And so, I think we should include at least asking downtown parking, but making a case to downtown parking more than asking downtown parking as part of the motion.
And if I could just clarify, I said June, but we really close our books in August. We could wait as late as August if time was needed.
I think it'd be better in June, so that we
agree.
are in general going forward with a balanced
Our
budget.
thought process is that we're not sure you're going to need this if we have some under expenditure or if revenues do a little better than we projected. And remember, we're dealing with $100 million budget, so we're now down to 0.4%, or 0.3% of the budget. So we felt, rather than decide now that you want to make that move, that you could wait until we close the books, and then if we ran short, these are the two options. We would come back to you and say, which one of these would you like to do? But it's up to, of course, the Finance Committee and the Council. And one,
well, we're going to need the money either this year or
Yeah.
next year, I guess you know, I mean, we're definitely going to need the money. I just, you know, think that we should, as Mr. Francisco said, we should check in with the Downtown Parking Committee about it. But I think we should make a case, not just ask them, because this is money that we are going to need desperately. And even the fact that we may not have the capital expenditures to do this next year means that we should even act with more urgency to do it for this fiscal year, because we know we have the capital expenditures where they will need. We could do this in this fiscal year.
Well,
because of
on the other
parking.
side, if you wanted to do this, to me, from a downtown parking committee standpoint, this is neutral to them. If you take RDA money and use it to backfill for capital, and then take their capital money and use it to pay for the maintenance, there's no impact at all on the downtown parking fund budget.
Well, then
They may not like it, but in terms of their fiscal situation, there's no impact whatsoever.
well, do we want to do it today, or do we want to check in with them?
I think we want to check in. I mean,
Okay. All right. So can I get a motion that includes this, the solid waste payback, and the staff recommendations?
okay, I move the staff recommendation with the following modifications: that we agendize with the Downtown Parking Committee this proposal here as a recommendation from the Finance Committee, but we want their feedback. That we examine a payback scheme to refund general fund monies that have been going into the solid waste fund through the solid waste franchise fee being diverted there over the years, however long that is. And otherwise, the recommendation as it stands.
Is there a second?
I second.
All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Great. Now, item 1, the capital improvement program.
Thank you.
Great, thanks.
No.
No.
Didn't see a big, heavy, bulky thing.
No tomes in evidence.
You should have gotten these delivered to you. on
Probably we
Friday.
did.
So I apologize for not having them bound for you. There should be one for you.
I'm gonna just call a 2-minute break for water and for loading slides.
My name is Christine Anderson. I'm the Public Works Director, and I'm here with Kathy Kiefauver, our Administrative Analyst in the Public Works Department, who did the heavy lifting along with the other representatives of the city departments that have capital projects in putting together the 6-year Capital Improvement Program, or CIP. I'm going to be walking you through an overview of the CIP document and sharing some of the changes that we've made to the format and the content of the document this year. On this presentation, I'll be focusing primarily on the financing aspects of the CIP. And when this comes back to council as a presentation on the 13th of April, we'll broaden the discussion and expand the focus to include more project-related information. So that will be coming at the next discussion of this item. Following the presentation, there are staff present from each of the program areas represented in the document, and they'll be available if you have any specific questions that we need to pull them in to answer. So with that, I'd like to begin by walking you through the purpose for the document. This is a capital improvement program that is intended to provide a balanced program for the capital improvement needs reflected in the city and also to make the link between the funding that we anticipate to be available or that we anticipate could be opportunity as a grant-funded kind of approach. So it's a planning document. It looks ahead over a 6-year period. It anticipates needs and tries to develop a strategy for the capital improvement projects that we anticipate needing to address the variety of different asset management needs, community goals and values. And it's also intended to illustrate the level of unmet need and the areas of capital improvement or capital maintenance that we are not anticipating the ability to fund over the coming 6-year period. The factors that affect the prioritization of projects in the document include the need to respond to regulatory requirements such as water and wastewater permits, stormwater permits, mitigation measures required for projects, and MOUs with other agencies. It also looks at projects that, if deferred, would result in a significantly higher cost over time, or would cause a deterioration of services that would affect our operating costs or the public. Some examples would be a pavement management project that could be an overlay in the current 1 or 2 years, but if deferred over the several-year period of time could result in the need for a reconstruction at a cost 5-fold or greater in actual cost to bring it back to a useful life. We have projects that are identified through policy directive and also just the normal maintenance and replacement projects that are part of maintaining our physical assets throughout the city. A capital project is generally defined as an activity that creates, improves, replaces, repairs, or maintains a fixed asset and generally has a useful life of at least 5 years. There are exceptions to that you'll find through the document, but generally speaking, that's the criteria that fall into play. I'd like to point you to the document itself. The first 6 pages reflect the transmittal letter that also serves as a bit of an executive summary of the document itself. That's followed by the table of comments and a reader's guide overview of the document. And on page 5, we begin the summary of planning processes and reports. And if you'd like to leaf through to page 5 in the document, one of the things that we changed this year in the format of the document was trying to pull together an explanation and description of the various planning documents, studies, asset management reports that are the underlying foundation for the development of projects. And we've also tried to identify the linkage in the specific project descriptions to the documents that these are developed from or that they respond to. So any of the projects that we have going forward for the city have some purpose or some rationale for need that links back primarily to the description of the planning documents that we've incorporated in the document itself. And if you'll go ahead. This is the CIP project page. It's also shown in the document itself, and it just gives you a brief overview of how to look at the specific project description pages and understand them. So starting in the upper right, you'll have the department and program identification. Moving over toward the left, there'll be a project title that's unique to each project. And then below that, a description of each of the projects, the purpose, the details of the project elements, and the anticipated funding sources. As you drop down, there'll be specific plans or policies relating to the project that are, once again, the link back to the genesis or the identification of need that this project was developed to respond to. And then below that, we've got our capital cost funding sources and estimated anticipated year of funding need. And then just below that, this is another new element to the document. It's an estimated operating impact. in the description in our charter, it looks to a request to identify the operating impact of capital projects, and that's always an extremely difficult challenge to isolate a particular cost associated with a capital project. And especially for the work that is encompassed in this document, most of it really relates to rehabilitation and replacement of existing project elements. So what we've attempted to do to provide some value of understanding the impact of a capital project is to look at those elements that are reflected below. We look to see if the facility is a new facility, a facility upgrade, a facility replacement, or a facility expansion. And if it's going to be anticipated to either reduce, maintain, or increase the level of maintenance cost associated with it. So it gives us a bit of a subjective read on an ability ultimately to be able to report to you on how much of the document reflects an existing level of maintenance to go forward, how much we see as being able to help reduce the level of operating costs if we've got an older facility that is costly to maintain and we're able to include energy efficiency measures. It may be, in effect, as a new facility, a lower operating expense. And then if it's an expansion or additional square footage or whatever the unit associated with the type of project may be, it could be an increase in the operating costs. But they'll give you a relative understanding of what is happening to the operating side without trying to characterize it in dollars. So we're beginning that process this year, as I mentioned. We still have a ways to go in refining it, but this is the strategy and trying to make a stab at understanding the impact of our capital budget to operating. Go ahead. The total 6-year plan looks at funded and unfunded projects, and I would say even more strongly than usual for a 6-year plan, the first 2 years are really the two to look at in terms of funding availability. We've had a real challenge over the last couple of years, as you know, in trying to make good projections of revenues and have reliability of the funding streams that we've been able to rely on in the past from other state and federal sources. So this reflects the 6-year plan, but looking at just the first 2 years of the plan, and that's what I'd encourage you to be focused on primarily. We've identified funded projects to a total of $160,673,009. And total unfunded projects in that 2-year window of $56,487,372. So the total is a CIP for the first 2 years of a little over $217 million. The unfunded projects are, generally speaking, those that would be the first candidates for grant applications for projects that we have some hope or expectation that if grant programs that we have been able to access in the past are available, that these would represent those projects that would be of highest priority to be able to look for funding for. So moving on. In the document this year, we've also added a new section on the different types of funding sources. So beginning on page 15, we have descriptions of the types of funds that support capital projects for the city. The first one, of course, is the city's general fund, and this accounts for activities and services that are traditionally associated with government, such as parks and recreation, police and fire, and libraries. They're also primarily funded through tax-generated revenues, sales tax, property tax, TOT, that sort of thing. Then the next category that we're capturing are the enterprise funds. And these are generally established to address operations that are similar in many ways to private business enterprises, or utilities, without a profit margin that's attached to it, but still with a sort of a business approach. And the categories of enterprise funds that we address and provide some description for in this document include the airport fund, the downtown parking fund, the creeks fund, the golf fund, the solid waste fund, the water fund, the wastewater fund, and the waterfront fund. Go ahead. And then the next category of funding sources are intercity service funds, or ICS funds. These are another category that of funding established to support the operations within the city. So the three primary areas are facilities maintenance, our building program, asset management program, the motor pool. So it's operating and in this case, the replacement of vehicles and equipment, and the information systems, ICS. And then we have another category of funds that we're calling designated funds that are essentially department funding sources that don't have a function as a particular enterprise fund but do have designated uses. So examples of these funds begin on page 19 and run through page 27. They include FAA, which is used within the airport fund for capital projects, the Creeks Fund, which includes Measure B funds and also grant funding. There are a variety of street funds that feed into transportation streets capital projects, including UUT, Measure A, and a number of transportation grant programs that we've tried to capture and reflect individually for you, so that we're hoping this serves as a resource. So if you're wondering where a source of particular grant funds comes from, whether it's a state or federal or a local program, we've tried to identify the source of the money, where it's generated, what the mechanism is, either the designation through federal or state allocation, in some instances whether or not matching funds are required to access those funds. Then we also have water state revolving funds that are used in capital projects associated with the water department. And the waterfront has the Harbor Preservation Fund and the Department of Boating and Waterways loans, the DBA loans. So those are examples that are captured in the document. We're hoping, as I said, that we're creating a useful tool for you, and as you use this over the course of the year, we're looking for feedback and comments that will help us continue to improve the document as a useful tool. This is the one location that I think we've created that does try to describe and provide a brief summary that is hopefully useful information regarding where these different types of funds come from. Leveraging is a big part of our capital improvement program strategy. I'd say city departments have been aggressive in seeking out grant funds that often require a city funding match or some initial contribution of funds to create a positive grant application. So you'll see that as part of the strategy reflected in how projects are intended to be funded. So I'd like to walk you briefly through the different department funding programs, and starting on page 33 with administration. The format for the document will give you...
Christine, can I ask real quick?
You bet.
In looking at the different summaries, is there any one that's just a summary of all the general fund related ones? Or can we get one on those?
Actually, that's the one area that we did not try to go through and sort out, but that's a good, I appreciate that comment. That's certainly something we can add to the document.
I would just love to have the same kind of summary pages as in Table A, but have it just to go through all this general fund projects.
That would certainly be something that would be, I think, a useful asset.
Great, thanks.
Thank you. In administrative services on page 33, this is the format that you'll find throughout the document. There is a one-line project name and the identification of the funding needs across the 6 years. And then following that summary page, each of the projects has its own project description page. And it, as I said in the earlier description of how to use the document, the page should give you the department, the specific title of the project, the description of the project, including the purpose and any specifics relative to that project that we can pull in as a descriptor, and then finally the specific plans and policies relating to the project, or that are the genesis for the project identification. The capital costs are split out by funding sources, and then once again we've attempted to begin the estimated operating impact piece. So for administrative services, the primary focus is enhancements to city software systems. The projects that are listed for administrative services are not identified for funding in the first fiscal year, even though there's a need of $1.2 million that's been identified. And I'll say in highlighting an area, and I'm sure you can ask for additional information as we go through the project-specific discussion at the council as a whole level, but certainly as you're going through this document yourself, the financial management system replacement is one that is reflected. It affects the entire organization because it obviously supports all the financial systems that each department relies upon, and it is a program that is going to need to be replaced in the near future. I'd say in the next certainly 3 to 4 years we're expecting. So it's been a challenge to identify the general fund level of participation that will be needed in the initial first 2 years of this plan. But I'll just highlight that as a certain high priority need as we go forward in the next 3 or 4 years. The next area on page 41 is the airport program. Once again, the airport is proposing about $30 million of projects over the 6-year planning period. Many of these are supported by FAA grants and airfield projects, and some of the drainage improvements and sewer system improvements are our main focus for the airport projects in the document. On page 65, the community development summary begins. These are primarily focusing on areas that support the management of the functions within community development, upgrading to an electronic permit submitting and processing system, and also the permit plan upgrade and records management. So it's primarily enhancements to support service delivery and maintenance of information and files. None of these projects are currently anticipated to be funded in the next 2 years. Creeks projects begin on page 71. These are projects that are primarily funded through grants and Measure B monies, and are focused on areas that enhance the stormwater carrying capacity and the water quality associated with stormwater programs. Page 93 is the Finance Department Environmental Services Programs. And this is where the Elings Park methane gas collection and control systems identified you were alluding to earlier. And that is the primary project identified for environmental services. On page 97, the fire department projects are identified. We don't have any anticipated projects that are funded for fiscal year 11, but we have identified needs for feasibility study at Station 7 and facilities upgrades to the fire training tower and the fire training facility classroom. in future years. On page 103, we identify library projects. And once again, this is another one of the funding sources that we're developing a description around. The library and in some instances Parks and Recreation have benefited from the creation of trusts or beneficiarial, I don't think that's a word, the bequests that have been made by private individuals to specific programs or for specific purposes within the library and Parks and Recreation program areas. So for the library in the coming year, the $90,000 identified in central library building renovations is the contribution from the Fenton Davison Trust that is, in essence, the contribution matching the Junior League anticipated fundraising program to improve the central library and create the children's library in the basement.
Is the carpet replacement program from a bequest, or is that general fund monies that have no real source of income?
The carpet replacement program is actually part of the facilities renewal program, so it's coming out of the ICS facilities reserves that we're using to address it. Carpet replacement sounds a little unnecessary. I don't want to say unnecessary, but it sounds like it's a minimal need. And actually what we're looking at is more of the rehabilitation of the central library in repainting and repair and recarpeting to essentially address the ongoing maintenance needs of the facility. So we captured the carpet piece. It's a broader description of actually providing the renewal maintenance that's needed for that facility.
That is general fund.
It is general fund.
And you know, I guess what I'm going to need to see for myself is understanding why in a year when we may be considering, you know, closing the library a whole day or having less staff, why that's going to be important to begin this year. Mm-hmm. Because I guess that's a hard sell to me why that would be important to begin this year. You know, I use it often. It's not great, but it's not terrible either. Mm-hmm. And I'd rather have librarians and an open library than have a nice looking one. So, you know, I don't know if we don't have to make that decision right now, but I suppose that would be the appropriate time to raise a stink about that would be when?
It's
right.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what I would love to see, and I guess I would ask that it be highlighted when we go through the library budget and not glossed over, because I think we'll probably at that time be concentrating on staffing issues more than little things like this. But I mean, that's one position right there, or you know, and 3 positions means a day open, so.
The only caveat I guess I would point out on this one is it is ICS funding, and there is a significant contribution that feeds into the ICS fund. Each of the departments basically pay a rate that supports the building operation and maintenance. And so the ICS fund is the source of the renewal for this particular project. So it's not specifically general fund, but there is a general fund feed into the ICS program.
Well, is all of our matching funds for all our general fund projects in the library ICS?
I believe so.
The department pays in for years so that when it's time to do this, it's available.
Yeah.
And there's still in that ICS fund.
It's not funded this year, though, is it?
Underfunded.
I think it's
So,
unfunded.
and then what Dewey does is decide, okay, in all of his facilities, what's the highest need and kind of prioritizes. And again, if you choose not to do this, the other thing is what other facility needs do we have? There's a $2.1 million annual gap in general fund facilities rule. So this is, I mean, it's the tip of the iceberg in terms of this. And, but, you know, it's a council priority. You could do this and say, let's pay for that librarian for one more year. But then next year, you still have a problem of you've used the money you have been saving for the last, 5 or 10 years to replace this carpet, and now you don't have any. That's the challenge.
Okay. I think that's ringing because you aren't at the mic.
Sorry to throw in that
Okay.
little confusion, but it's there. Page 113 is the beginning of the Parks and Recreation project list. Parks and Recreation has identified 49 projects that are needed over the 6-year planning period. During the first year, there are general fund projects that are funded, including playground equipment replacement. This is a program that has been underfunded in the last couple of years as we've tried to identify areas where we could hold back and sift through options for the general fund deficit. But it's at a point where I think there's concern that we need to keep that replenishment of playground equipment as a safety issue. Shoreline Park Phase 1 is listed for general fund funding, and then Mesa Lane Steps replacement is another phase, the initial level of work that would be needed to support the ability to apply for grant funding for the project is the strategy there. We also are intending to use ICS funds for some of the ball field renovation and Cabrillo park spalling and concrete repair. So there are some other places that are being covered as well through the ICS facilities program. Speak to those. Then on page 149, the police department identified needs. The department records management system is actually being funded through, I believe, general fund. And in the new department headquarters building line item, as you are aware, we have been looking at some rehabilitation of the current police headquarters building. We will be coming back to you probably in May with a request for a seismic analysis of the building to determine what next steps are really appropriate to try and address needs in that building. There is RDA funding that's been allocated and is reflected in Appendix D. We've tried to capture all of the RDA projects lists as an appendix in this document. One of the things we're going to be working on for future CIPs is to try and actually merge and incorporate RDA funding and RDA projects as part of the CIP list itself. But we've referenced the RDA where it was appropriate in terms of projects identified in the CIP that we are aware of. And that is one that you will be seeing, but it's through the RDA funding program. Then on page 155, we have downtown Public Works downtown parking. These are generally projects that are focused on repair of existing facilities and upgrades to the operating systems to improve efficiency of the parking program. And on page 179, we have the Public Works General Fund projects. Once again, these are, in many instances, the facilities projects that are ICS funded. We've also, as I mentioned, we've included the Cabrillo Pavilion concrete spalling repair and replacement of sports field lighting at Dwight Murphy Ball Field, and the rehabilitation to the Central Library as funded through this program. We've also included, for the first time in the CIP, the fleet replacement program. And it's identified on page 189 in the document. The thing I wanted to point out about how this actually works as a program, we have a life cycle expectation for pieces of equipment and condition analysis that goes into trying to project when replacement of equipment will be needed. And this is a forecast using that kind of a model. When we actually get into the year of a specific trigger for a piece of equipment being eligible to be considered for replacement, we scrutinize the condition of the vehicle or piece of equipment, the ability to extend the useful life for another year or two, and hopefully beyond if that's possible. But this is more of the plan and is a basis for being able to establish a rate structure. But we also have when we began the program, it was an underfunded replacement program. So portions of a replacement rate were paid in up until about 4 years ago, I believe. And then we shifted it to fully funded in terms of annual rate type of program. But we still have a catch-up for the underfunded program that began 4 years ago. And so even though we may not be fully replacing what is provided as a projection in any given year, if we extend that life and are able to continue to replenish the replacement fund, ultimately we'll be in a better balance of what the needs are for replacement of our vehicles and what the actual reserve fund looks like. So, for example, in the last certainly 3 to 4 years, we've replaced some large pieces of fire equipment. And in most instances, if we had 50% of the actual replacement value of those vehicles that had been contributed as a replacement rate, we were lucky. So that meant we had to extract from the reserves that full amount. And so we're still in a catch-up mode, is what I'm trying to describe. So this is, once again, our first attempt to try and capture what is a fairly significant capital expenditure and identified in the CIP. On page 199, we begin the Public Works Streets Transportation Program projects. And once again, these cover a wide variety of transportation program areas, from bicycle, pedestrian, bridge, street rehabilitation, intersection, and traffic signal types of projects. So it's probably the longest list you'll see of specific projects. But as you go into the project by project description, hopefully it'll be easier to identify what the purpose, what the origin of a particular project stems from, and how the anticipated funding, even if it's listed as an unfunded project, we try to point to the type of grant that would be a target for possible eligibility. Then on page 293, we have the wastewater projects. The wastewater projects are primarily asset maintenance that is based on the Wastewater Capital Program Strategic Plan implementation. And following that, on page 301, we have the water projects. Once again, these primarily stem from the Cater 10-year strategic plan and our asset management plans for the distribution system rehabilitation, our pump stations, reservoirs, and water mains. And finally, on page 315, the waterfront projects are identified. Major projects for fiscal year 11 include rebuilding Marina One walkways, repairing the breakwater cap, and providing annual repairs to both the marina and the Stearns Wharf, and also dredging the West Beach. Following the description of projects, we do have appendices listed in this document. We have the list of all funded projects under Appendix A, the list of all unfunded projects under Appendix B. A description of the fiber optics program is attached as Appendix C. The RDA capital program summary is Appendix D. And there are a listing of neighborhood improvement task force projects that are listed in Appendix E. So while it's, as I mentioned, still a work in progress, we do expect to update this CIP next year to stay in sync with the operating budget. And we are intending to make additional improvements to continue to make this both a useful, reliable, and accessible tool for understanding city capital programs and projects. So with that, I'll turn it back to the committee, and I'm available to answer any questions or refer them to the staff that are here to represent their program areas.
Any questions from committee members?
I have a bound one.
No, I don't have any questions.
Great. Then we'll adjourn. Thank you.
Thank you.